Hey there, vinyl community. I thought I would follow up on some promises I made and do some more topical videos, some more artist and composer centered videos. And honestly, I thought, what better of a band to start with than a band I've been listening to for well over a decade. And this is a band I really think is one of the most underrated metal bands out there making music today. Those that watch my channel know I dabble in metal. I really kind of am more of a punk and hardcore guy. When I'm talking about heavy music, of course, I like lots of different kinds of music. But I do dabble in metal. I was especially into metal a lot more when I was in high school and first couple years of college. Especially a lot of the progressive stuff. Like I love Between the Buried and Me, Opeth, The Human Abstract, Tesseract, things like that. And I've been getting into, over the years, I've gotten a little bit into black metal, especially a lot of the French black metal, things like that. Death Heaven are, of course, a lot of fun, even though metalheads hate them. But I've always dabbled in metal without really, I guess, being able to call myself a metalhead, just because the spectrum of things I listen to is rather narrow within metal. But I enjoy a lot of it. And I'm always looking to listen to more stuff. But one metal band that I've kind of stuck with over the years is the Japanese band Darren Gray. And I don't think this band gets the recognition they deserve. I think specifically because there is a language barrier and because they are a foreign band. And I think also because of their fan base, which is I would describe as more or less of a cult. It's really kept them from breaking through into the mainstream metal scene here, at least in North America. They've had a little more success in Europe and South America, but for some reason, I guess because there's so much to offer in the American metal scene, artists that don't really bother to completely sing in English, they get overlooked. So I thought I would get out all my CDs and records, or at least the ones that I have here. There's a couple missing that I have in Phoenix. And kind of talk a little bit about their discography and why I think they're one of the best bands. This band, Darren Gray, they came out in the late 90s out of the Japanese Visual Kei scene, and if you don't really know what that is or what I'm talking about, go back and watch one of my record update videos where I kind of gave a rundown. So they came out of this scene, but they really quickly realized that this was a constricting musical style for them and a constricting kind of musical environment in terms of what labels were expecting and what the public was expecting from a band that was called quote unquote a Visual Kei band. So they moved out of that genre really quickly and soon kind of started carving out their own path. I don't have their first couple albums with me, but I think this entire band's discography is worth listening to. Every album is so different. Every album has its own style, and if you listen to them in order, you can really hear the progression of a band that's kind of searching for a unique, slice of style and sound to carve out for themselves. Their first full-length album, Gauze, is an incredibly well-produced, what I would call kind of heavy pop rock album. There's definitely some heavier moments on it, but you can tell it's really heavily produced by, Yoshiki of X Japan was really involved in the production of that album. So while I think it's a great album on its own, it's missing a lot of the things that I think make Darren Gray such a great band. Their second full-length album, though, Macabre, I think is really when the band came into their own. They're really starting to explore some weirder elements. The title track on this album is an 11-minute or something, about 11 minutes of just this incredible experimental ballad that they do, and I think every track on here is pretty much golden. If I were to pick an album of their early work, I think this is a really great example of what they were doing when they were young cats. Their third full-length album, Kisu, my copy of that is in Phoenix. I'll show it up here in the magic empty space. That's another good album. I think that's also a transitional album for them, though, and it's not one of my favorites, but I think it's also a solid album. That came out in about, I want to say 2002, 2003, and Also, no, that came out in 2002, and then 2003 was when they kind of started to reach a turning point in the band. At this time they were, getting older, and they were starting to want to move out of the box that the Japanese music industry was trying to put them in. They released this EP, Six Ugly, which has the distinction of being the only Darren Gray album I don't like. This album is interesting because, it's 6 songs, Six Ugly, and it was their self-acknowledgement of the fact that they were trying to move in a heavier direction. So this is very much, I could say, their first metal album. This is the first metal album Darren Gray made. And the problem, I think, with that is they went in a heavier direction without keeping a lot of their good songwriting and a lot of their good arrangements that they were well known for as a band. And because of that, they just have 6 kind of mediocre heavy songs on here. The only track on here that I can really get into is the opening one, Mr. Newsman, which has a really, really catchy riff, but unfortunately not much goes on after that catchy riff. To their credit, like, a couple of these songs are actually re-recordings of older songs in an attempt to make the older songs heavier. I don't know if that was entirely successful. I just wanted to point out that album, though, because it was really a turning point for the band in exploring a heavier sound, and it led to what I think is one of their truly great albums. This is their 2003 album, full-length, Vulgar. You can see the European price sticker on this. I picked up this CD when I was in Wolfsburg, Germany, in a bookstore CD section when I was 14, I think, when I was on exchange in Germany. This album got released. This was the first Darren Gray album to get released outside of Japan, and got released in Europe. Did not get released in North America, but it did get released in Europe, and I found this in that bookstore there, so I've been hanging on to it ever since. This is really the band kind of using their songwriting prowess to approach a kind of a hard rock and almost heavy metal genre. There's some really, really great songs on here. Some classic Darren Gray songs that they're still playing even today. Audience Killer Loop is an incredible album opener. Shokubeni is just one of the heaviest songs they've ever written. That riff is just, you hear that opening riff in Shokubeni and it's just evil sounding. And some of the ballads on here, like Drain Away, Kasumi, and Amber. Amber, I think, is one of the best slow songs the band's ever written, because it just has a groove to it, and it just kind of grooves, and it never really boils over, even though you think it will eventually. So some really great stuff on here. I wish the production on this album was a little better. The drums sound very tinny and metallic to me, and everything just kind of has a layer of distortion that I think whoever was mastering this kind of put in to make the album sound heavier. But I feel like the distortion they added just kind of makes the album sound muddier, and that's muddier doesn't always equal heavier. And I would have wished for a better mix, because the songs on this album are really great. Here we come to a really great album, and I think what is kind of a landmark album for the band. This is 2004's Withering to Death. This was the album that they really broke ground with. This was the album that got them attention in North America, that got them an international release. This is their first North American release of any of their albums. Because this came out about a year after the original Japanese album was released, and was really nice as they included a bonus DVD with it too. This was the first Darren Gray album that I ever listened to, and I think it's a really good place to start. If you're really curious about Darren Gray, I think this and one other album that I'm going to get to are really good places to kind of start to explore the discography. I think this is just one of the best hard rock albums I've ever heard. It does everything right. It's not quite a full metal album, because there's some kind of traditional rock songs on this, but they just do it so well. The arrangements are so good. The vocals are so good. This was the album where the singer Kyo was really starting to stretch his vocal abilities. Up until now, his singing had been rather, he's always done both screaming and singing in the entire discography up to this point. But this was the album where he really started to stretch his abilities. He tried to see, what different sounds he could get out of his voice, what different singing tones, what different screaming tones. He was exploring kind of the upper end of his range for the first time. You see here I'm starting to hit higher and higher notes progressively, and there's some falsetto in this album. And one thing I love about this album is it's just really well paced. It hits you with that really energetic opening. Opening couple tracks are just really, really heavy and pummeling, and that kind of gives way to this lull in the middle of the album, and then kind of the anthems come in at the end of the album. And I think that's the perfect way to pace an album. And I think it's one of the best album pacings they've ever done. This is also a really special album to me because it was the first Darren Gray album I ever listened to. This album came out right when I started to hear about the band, and it was the first, I'd heard some of their songs before, but this was the first actual album I had on my old iPod mini that I would, take to camp with me, and I'd have a lot of time to just sit and listen to this album. And, one thing I will say about Darren Gray, their music and their albums, especially their albums, is they do really well with repeated listens. Some bands, you can get the gist of what they're doing right away. And I've just noticed with Darren Gray, every time a new Darren Gray album has come out, the first time I listened to it, I've been somewhat disappointed, and then I'll listen to it again, and then I'll listen to it again, and I'll love it more and more with each listen. There's really so much going on, and there's so many layers, and a lot of times the sounds they're exploring are so new and jarring that it does take a little while to get into. They're definitely a band that deserves some time. So that's my only advice to you if you're looking to give one of this band's albums a listen, which I really think this is a great one to start with, Withering to Death. I really think this is a great album to start with, but I would recommend any album you listen to by them, give it a couple listens. Because that's really, I think, the way they were meant to be enjoyed. When this album came out, they started to tour Europe and America more. They played some really big festivals. They played like Wacken Open Air in Germany. And so this was really when they started to get some recognition. And when they were playing all these festivals, they were playing to crowds who had no idea who they were. Nobody knew who this crazy Japanese band was, and so they kind of did their absolute best to put their heart and soul into touring. And this was around 2005, 2006. Put their heart and soul into touring and giving their shows everything they had, and it shows if you go back and look at live performances from this era. They were just completely overexerting themselves. Half the time after they'd be done playing, you'd see the singer Kyo collapsed on stage, panting and covered in water and stuff. And I think that kind of exertion and that kind of drive drove them to make what I think is one of the heavier albums they ever came out with. This is their 2007 album, Marrow of a Bone, which is definitely a metal album for sure this time. It's more of a new metal, what I would describe as like a new metal album, or a kind of raw. This is definitely their most raw album in terms of the production and the songwriting. It's incredibly unrelenting. The vocals are really strained and dirty. The guitar work is some of the lower tunings they've ever used. It's really, really dissonant stuff. Some of those songs on here I think are really good. The Deeper Vileness, I think, is just one of the most pummeling, unforgiving songs this band has ever written. And there's also some really good ballads on here. Conceived Sorrow, the opener, is a great ballad, and so is The Pledge. Unfortunately, I think in their drive to just become a heavier band again, they kind of missed the mark with a little bit of their songwriting. And so for me, I think this is one of the more forgettable Darren Gray albums. It's just not, their songwriting abilities weren't on full display here, and I think in a effort to make a heavier album that appealed more to Western audiences, they left out a lot of the unique elements that make them who they are with their own voice. Fortunately, on their next album in 2008, they completely solved this problem, and I made what I think is still their greatest album they've ever produced. That is 2008's Ouroboros. Try saying that fast. Ouroboros is, I just think, the perfect Darren Gray album. It encompasses everything that's great about the band. It's paced incredibly well. This is the album where they actually started to experiment with death metal, more European metal genres rather than like the American nu metal sound they were doing on their last album. but they also struck a really good balance in their songwriting. They started to make longer songs. This album opens with the 8, 9, 10 minute or so track Venushka, which is again one of my favorite Darren Gray songs. So they were experimenting with longer song structures. They were starting to get more progressive. In addition to getting heavier and having a death metal sound, they also developed a progressive death metal sound. So they would jump between these incredible kind of earthy, otherworldly growls and screams and heavy moments, and then intersperse them with great choruses or parts of really incredible beauty, like a lot of European death metal bands would sometimes do. So this is probably by far my favorite Darren Gray album, and so this album is also a really good place to start, especially if you're more of a metalhead. If you're coming at this band with a background in like harder rock, I would say start with Withering to Death. But if you're approaching this band from someone who's a metalhead, who has a lot of experience with, death metal, progressive metal, black metal, anything like that, I would say start with this album, Ouroboros. And to further that point, I would be a little more specific about which version you got. This is the vinyl version done by the American label The End Records. This was their American label, their American subsidiary label for the longest time. They put out the 2 albums before this on CD, and this was their first vinyl release, except for their very first album, Gauze, got pressed in a batch of 100 when it came out and was only given to industry people, which is one of the rarest records I have in my Discogs want list. I don't think I'll ever see one in person. So this is the first real vinyl release the band's ever done. And they released it. They released a special edition in Japan that had a 2 LP vinyl in it, and they also released this 2 LP vinyl in America. Unfortunately, the original mix of Ouroboros, and I have here the CD special edition, you can tell I love this album a lot. Unfortunately, the original mix that came out in 2008 of this album on both the Japanese and the American releases, because this final record is pressed from this CD. It's not I don't think they mastered it for vinyl. It doesn't sound like it to me. But whatever format you're on, the mix is okay, but it's not great. There's a lot of echo effects going on in the instruments, especially on the drums, to try to make them sound really big, but I think the result of that was the mix sounds kind of muddy. Excuse me. The mix sounds kind of muddy. And I loved this record for the longest time. I listened to it a ton when it came out. But in 2012, they did a remaster of the album. And that's the one I think that is really the one to look for and to listen to if you have the option of listening to it. I think if I don't listen through Spotify, but if you listen through Spotify, I think the 2012 remaster is on there. It's called Darren Gray Ouroboros Remastered and Expanded. They released this on CD in America and Japan. This is the Japanese version because at this point I'm a total nerd and I'm going to get the Japanese version because come on, their CDs are nicer. Their CD cases are nicer. This is the most robust jewel case I think I've ever seen in my life. I'll pay the extra $8 to $10 and just import the Japanese version. For some reason, physical copies of this 2012 remaster are actually very difficult to find now. If you just go and order the CD on Amazon without specifying what version, you're going to get sent the original 2008 version. So I don't know why this 2012 remaster has become so rare, but it is hands down heads and tails above the original release. This remastering, it keeps all the intensity of the original album and but kind of just clears it up so that you can hear so much more detail. Like I can hear the bass lines now. I can hear what the second guitar is doing during the lead part. I can hear more detail just in the entire mix. I can hear each individual instrument sound stages better. And I think because of that, it's a much more enjoyable experience because it's still, heavy and dynamic and all these different things, but without the, terrible kind of distortive echo that was going on in the original mix. So yeah, I think if your takeaway from this is you want to go listen to one Darren Gray album, I would say listen to the 2012 remaster of Ouroboros. I just think this thing is a masterpiece. I've loved a lot of Darren Gray releases since this came out, but this is still the one I go back to the most. It's just the band's magnum opus, and this remastering job is really great. So, highly recommend this. To follow up such a great album like Ouroboros, it took a lot of effort, and what resulted in that is probably the most depressing and dark album this band has ever done, and that is 2011's Dum Spiro Spero. So this album, while they were in pre-production for this album, while they were in like the final writing stages and getting ready to record the album, that is when the Japanese earthquake took place. I'm sure everyone here is familiar with the earthquake that struck Japan in 2011, instigated the Fukushima incident. It was all over the news for a very long time, but it was a very, really difficult time for Japan during that time, because not only were they struck with this terrible natural disaster, this earthquake, they also had to deal with their government and the people they trusted with their lives, the nuclear power industry, and the regulators associated with it. They had to deal with them basically lying to them about how safe they were, about what's going to happen to their country, what's going to happen to the people that live in these areas. It was a really dark time in Japan, and it still is. A lot of these questions are still unresolved. So all that was going on in Japan while this album was being cut and made. And in my opinion, it shows in the album that came out, which is the darkest, most depressing, most brutal album this band has ever done. I mean, this is the band's kind of take on doom metal. If you like doom metal, like Neurosis, things like that, this is what you're really going to like. The songs here are longer. The tunings are lower. They're using some crazy 8-string guitar low tunings on a lot of these that sound, very, very, very evil. There's some evil songs on this album. Everything from Ouroboros is kind of turned up a little bit. Kyo's doing some more inventive vocals. The arrangements are getting more and more progressive. And they're really kind of finding their abilities as a progressive death metal, doom metal band in this album, I think. That's not to say it's quite as good as the last one. There's some songs that kind of fall flat. I think the opening track, the Blossoming Beelzebub, is kind of a meandering doom metal song that goes nowhere. There's a couple other tracks on here that are a little bit forgettable, intermixed with what I think are some truly great tracks here, like Ruten no To and Diablos, Lotus, Amon. There are some really, really brilliant, amazing tracks on here, and the pacing of the album is really good. I just, unlike Ouroboros, where every single track was a pure gold, and every single bit of the album was an engaging listen. Here it's just not quite at that level, but it's still a really great album. And this is, of course, the 2011 U.S. vinyl release by The End Records. I also have it on CD. And this is the last album that was by Darren Gray that was released in North America. Their releases since haven't been, and I think that's really sad. After 2011's Dum Spiro Spero, I was wondering what the band were going to do. They did release this EP in 2013. The Unraveling has a couple new songs, but mostly it's a reworking of some of their older songs in a heavier style. The older songs were somewhat special to me, so it's hard for fans to listen to reworkings. But the new material and the new tracks on here didn't really do much for me, and especially the Unraveling, that single, I found that a little bit unfocused and not my cup of tea. So for the most part, this album has been pretty forgettable for me. So after the release of Dum Spiro Spero, I was kind of curious as to the direction the band would be taking after that. Are they going to keep going down this rabbit hole and become the most brutal Japanese band to ever make mainstream success? I was really curious as to what they were going to do. And in 2014, they came out with this album, Arche. And again, just like The Unraveling, this was only released in Japan, only on CD, which is kind of disappointing. I don't know why their albums aren't being released in America anymore. I guess it has to do with the fact that physical music in general is just kind of declining, especially in North America, whereas in Japan, people still actually will go out and buy CDs because copy protections over there are a lot more stringent, and people don't stream. They really still do buy CDs for the most part. I mean, the trends are still going in the direction of streaming, but it's less of a thing in Japan as it is in North America. This album was very, very interesting because when I first listened to it, I didn't really enjoy it. I was a little baffled because, their last full-length Doomsparrow Sparrow was such a heavy album. Just this incredibly pummeling album. And here, this is kind of the band kind of re-exploring its softer roots. It's more. It would be unfair to call this a pop album because it's not. It's still a metal album, but there's definitely more of a focus on ballads on this album. The best tracks on here are the ballads, especially Tose, which is I think one of the better ballads they've ever written. And there's some good heavy stuff on here too. But I really think this is a slower paced album. This is them kind of taking their new sound that they've kind of hacked out on the last couple albums, their new kind of progressive metal sound, and they're taking that sound and kind of exploring some of their roots, some of their earlier material, and kind of taking some songwriting cues from their earlier material and incorporating it into their new sound. So there's a lot more melody on this album. This is probably their most melodic album in well over a decade. Some of the vocals on here are incredibly beautiful. The instrumentals are great. The really low-tuned 8-string guitars are kind of gone on this album, and they're back to like a more traditional 6-string setup. This is by no means one of the greatest Dir en Grey albums, but it's a really, really great listen, and especially for someone who's... I think this is definitely an album to visit after you've listened to some more of their material. Because this is kind of like a breath of fresh air after, a couple albums of just pummeling darkness. Not to say there isn't pummeling darkness on this, but it is a refreshing bit of melody in their discography. And it took me a long time to really appreciate that about this album, because I was looking for like the metal epics of the last couple albums, and I didn't find them on this. And so initially I was a little bit disappointed. And then I listened to it some more, and some of the hooks on this thing are just great. Very inventive stuff going on here. So I actually really like it. And 2014 is the last time this band has released a full-length album. It's been a really long time since a release. They've had some really great singles since then. I have some of their singles they've released in that time. These are the special edition singles. Are good, and they're building up to an album that's supposed to be released in September. Already pre-ordered that sucker from Japan. And I'm really looking forward to it because these singles they've been putting out have been really interesting. So I think around September 14th, the new album comes out, and I'm looking forward to it. And if I get a copy, when I finally get a physical copy, I will probably talk a little bit about it on one of my videos. But I just wanted to give a rundown of what I think is one of the most diverse and unique discographies in all of metal. This band gets overlooked a lot, and I think a lot of it is A, because they're not an English-speaking band, B, because they get thrown in with a lot of Japanese rock music, which can be, especially nowadays, rather derivative and annoying, and can mimic some of the problems associated with the Japanese pop industry. Not to mention the fact that Dir en Grey fans can be objectively kind of awful. The couple times I've seen them live, the band was incredible. As someone that goes to a lot of punk and metal shows, I can say with a sense of somewhat objectivity that the crowds at North American Dir en Grey shows are a little terrible. I think my observation has been that their core fan base seems to not be metalheads or people that are normally into heavy music. There's a lot of people that like them for maybe the novelty of the band. And I think that's really sad, because I think if you were just to take and sit down and listen to their music, you would find one of the most innovative and groundbreaking metal bands of the last 20 years. But because of that stigma, they were unapproachable for a lot of people for a long time. I think the internet is changing that, and especially, I think one of the dumber internet trends of the last couple of years has been react videos. I find I have a special contempt for react videos, and especially the Fine Brothers stuff, which is just the kind of stuff that just rots your brain. However, some of the music react channels, people have been suggesting Duran Gray to these metal reviewers, these people who will react to metal. And I think the only upside of this trend is that a lot of people who are obsessed with metal and talking about metal, and metalheads who are watching these videos are getting exposed to this band for the first time in an environment where they're literally just sitting down and listening to the music. And I think that's helping right now to spread the popularity of this band in a more serious way, in a way that's more about the music and about the artistic output than any type of fandom. As much as I don't really care for YouTube React culture, I have to give that culture props for introducing this band to more people. So, I mean, I know I have a couple metalheads on this channel. Does anyone have any experience with this band? Have you listened to any albums? Let me know in the comments. Give some of this band's material a listen. Ask me for suggestions. Again, I think a great place to start is Ouroboros, or their more hard rock album, Withering to Death. Give those albums a listen if you're into heavy music, metal, or even just hard rock. Because I think, if you're a fan of bands like the Deftones, Tool, Faith No More, things like that, if you're into this kind of progressive hard rock, progressive heavy metal, progressive new metal, I think this band is right up your alley, especially Tool. I often say, Duran Gray are the Tool of Japan. And I think that's the best comparison I could draw. I'm sure someone has a better one. But yeah, if you're a fan of this band, let me know. If you've never heard this band before and you just checked out a song or two and want to know a direction to go in, let me know. I'll include, I didn't do live music clips or recorded music clips in this one. I'm so tired of fighting YouTube copyright hell anytime I use music clips in any of my videos that I'm just not going to anymore. And I'm just going to talk about the music and give you links down in the description of where you can check this stuff out, because I get tired of dealing with all that in YouTube Creator, things that are very, very clearly fair use. I'm doing like less than 30 seconds and giving credit and everything, and I'm not monetizing any of these freaking videos. And but YouTube algorithm is just intentionally hostile to people like us. So yeah, I will provide a link to probably a live set by the band, because I think another thing about this band is that they really are at their best in a live environment, because then you really get to see, they really are like Tool, and that they have a really big production in their shows. Like, there's all these projections, and they deck out the stage really well, and it really is kind of a full sensory experience when you see this band live, especially the shows they do in Japan. When they tour America and Europe, they kind of have a touring setup, so they can't really do the whole thing. Or like when they play festivals, they really can't do a lot of the cool stuff that they do when they play home shows in Japan. So I'll link you to a show they did in Japan or something like that. There's tons of them on YouTube. So yeah, live is definitely the way to witness this band. They're crazy. So yeah, that was just a video talking about what I think is the most underrated metal band in existence today, and one of my personal favorite bands, and a band that got me into a lot of other different types of heavy music and had me explore a lot of other different types of metal. Thanks for sitting with me through this long video talking about something I'm passionate about. A lot of my audience is classical or jazz people, so I know when I do rock videos, some of you guys are just kind of will tune it out, or you'll suffer through a long video about a genre of music you don't care about, and I'm sure the rock people feel the same way when I do a classical video or when I do a jazz video. So I understand. I'm just trying to be honest on this channel and talk about all the different types of music that I really enjoy. And this is definitely, Duran Gray is big part of that. They're a big important band to me, and I wanted to share a little bit of my collection and talk about how the music has affected me. So thanks for sitting through all that, VC, and check out their music if you were interested in anything that I talked about or are curious, and I'd love to hear what you think of it. Until next time, cheers, VC.